welcome to You and Your Money. I'm Bryan this evening. Our program focuses on rising costs over the next 10 to 20 years. While I intend to address this, inflation will have a significant impact on healthcare, energy and food prices. My guest this evening will discuss the challenges households face, particularly retirees, as they navigate the rising costs of these essential needs. And my first slide is one that I always like to show. It just reflects what happens over a period of time with a shopping basket and after 6 years. People don't always understand that inflation, year to year is just a creep up, but over a 5-10 year period to see what happens. I've always emphasized that for a secure retirement, retirees must ensure they are firstly debt-free, they own a fully paid home and have a comprehensive healthcare plan. The key challenges ahead for them are inflation and longevity. And the following slide will just give you an example of someone who has 2 million invested, giving them 12,000 per month. Each one of our viewers can multiply this in terms of their income requirements. While this slide shows 2 million rand invested, will give you 12,000 rand after tax. In 10 years' time, you will need to have that same amount of money, grow your capital at a 7% inflation to 3.6 million, in 20 years' time to 6.4. And if you one of the unfortunate where your inflation rate is even at 10%, you'll need a lot more. So you need to understand that you need to grow your capital in retirement. Retirement is not a line in the sand. Retirement is about continuing to beat inflation. The next slide reflects the CPI averages over 4 to 5% to 6%. Pension inflation, that's what's happened over the last 20 years. And you can see inflation's averaged around about 5 to 6%. There have been some spikes. However, inflation is driving pension up to close to 8%. And this is driven primarily by medical aid, electricity and food prices. I'm also obviously excluding other factors such as rates and taxes, insurance and debit costs, which can fluctuate either upward or downward. And joining me this evening is Dr. Shay Ganesh. She's Chief Medical Officer of MedShield Medical Scheme. Lisa Spey-Fine, who's Chief Commercial Officer, Recharge Commercial Solar Rentals, and Tertius Carses, former CEO, Pioneer Foods, PepsiCo South Africa, in the Zoom room from Stellenbosch. Ladies, thank you for joining me. Tertius, are you with us?
I'm with you, Bryan. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us from Stellenbosch. Shay, my first question to you is I'm going to put up a slide because if one looks at this slide, it's quite frightening that our members, especially retirees, to understand what inflation is doing to the medical aid. Okay, you can't really see that slide. I can't see it, but hopefully viewers on TV can see it a lot better. It shows last year's increases, all the different medical aids, anything between 9 and 12%. And it also shows what's happened over the last 5 years, how medical aids have gone up. It shows very much that in 2021, most schemes offered below average inflation increases due to COVID. 2022, increases range between 4 and 5. 23 contributions returned to pre-pandemic levels with average increases between 5 and 8, 224, 8 to 10, and 225, 9.3 to 12.8. My question to you, Shay, is this going to continue? Because if it does, at an 8% inflation rate in 9 years' time, your medical aid will double. Someone paying 10 or 15 can double it, and in another 9 years, you can double it again. So someone in maybe a comprehensive medical aid, maybe paying 15,000, will pay 8 to 9 years 30,000, and a further 8 to 9 years 60,000. Where are retirees going to find this money? So let's talk about why medical aid is increasing at these levels. What is causing this to happen?
So thanks, Bryan. Thanks for having me. So I think we need to understand that as South Africans, we are getting sicker, we're getting sadder, and we're getting fatter. So a lot of those are some of the main cost drivers as to why we're seeing so much of chronic disease in our population. In fact, the World Health Organization has recently released a report that says about 30% of our South African population does have a chronic disease. Now, when I talk chronic disease, Bryan, I'm talking hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, and these are really the inherent sort of diseases that are fueling these costs. Couple that with an aging population, with a higher disease prevalence in terms of cancer, etc. And this is some of the reasons as to why we're seeing a lot of these changes. In addition, you must note the rate of research and development that's happening in terms of the newer drugs. So a lot of the newer drugs are coming onto the market, coupled with a lot of newer devices that we're using to manage a lot of the new cancers and the chronic diseases. And this is actually the reason as to why we're finding these costs kind of increase year on year. So a lot of this coupled together is actually the reasons or the kind of the high cost drivers we're seeing in the South African environment.
So I'm going to come back with a couple of questions, particularly from a wellness point of view, but I want to bring Lisa in. Nice to have you on the show. Lisa, we're getting 12.3% increases in electricity, and I'm going to put a slide on just to show our viewers again what is happening with the electricity cost, and here it is. Electricity costs, and again, I don't have it as well defined as on the TV, but I do have the slide here, which talks about electricity costs, Eskom tariff increasing over the 15-year period 653% and inflation 129%. So enormous increases. And that's one of the things that's frightening. I mean, you think about pensioners who are now getting a 12.3% increases. But it doesn't start there. It starts in business. And so both businesses are faced. We'll come back to what's happened to solar, particularly that we've had 300 days of no load shedding because we've got load reduction. I don't know what the difference between load shedding and load reduction is. Maybe you can deal with that. So let's just talk about ways of saving electricity. We've spoken about medical aid. We're going to talk about wellness, but just give us the broad brushstrokes.
Great. Nice to be here, Bryan. Thank you for having me. So I think consumers and businesses need to start thinking about how they can hedge their future energy costs given the increases that you just spoke about. The way for them to do that is to consider some form of solar solution. They could consider a grid-tied solution, which is just solar panels, or they could consider a hybrid solution, which involves batteries. Now, it's very difficult for a business and a consumer to even know where to start. So with the business that I'm involved in, Recharge Commercial Rental Solutions, we can provide a turnkey solution to businesses or customers. We can connect them with EPCs or installers that would come and do an assessment of their property, and they could then understand how they could get savings on their properties. There would be no administration for the business or the client. It would just be the system would be installed and then they would then benefit from the savings. Businesses and consumers need to consider this because it is a cost that is going to continuously creep up with as an expense, as you said earlier on.
Yeah, Lisa, in the next segment I want to talk because the solar business seems to have stalled because people are saying we're not having load shedding. They don't realize it's not just about having lights on, it's about saving costs.
Correct.
And that's really what this program is about. But I'd really like to bring in Tertius. Good evening to you, and thank you for joining us. Tertius, one of the areas that affects South Africans, and particularly we talk about inflation and going ahead, is food prices. And maybe just put some context on, you've been in food for many, many years in your life. What is happening there, and how can consumers actually find ways of reducing their food bills?
Good evening, Bryan. It's beautiful to be with you and the team here tonight. We must keep on reminding ourselves that in a South African context, our food pricing in general is fully exposed to what happens internationally with the supply and demand of the commodities or the raw materials that we use to produce food in South Africa. And also because it's mostly related to agriculture, we're exposed to the vagaries of what happens to weather patterns internationally. For example, wheat is a good example, Bryan. South Africa imports more than half of what it requires to sustain ourselves. So we buy it in dollar terms internationally. We pay for shipping in dollar terms to get it to South Africa. And therefore, for example, the international price and the rand-dollar exchange rate determines the local price for commodities such as wheat, which eventually ends up in flour and bread. And therefore, you can see from the slide that it is extremely volatile compared to its 18% contribution to inflation in general. Speaking about what can consumers do, I think we must be wise in how we shop. We've got a very efficient retail and wholesale system that offers best pricing on a daily basis. So we must be very careful where and what we shop for. And then obviously food waste in South Africa remains a big thing as it is internationally. And it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we limit food waste as best as possible, even in individual households.
Tertius, if a GOA is removed from South Africa, and one of the benefits we get is export of agriculture, is that going to? What is going to happen then? Are we going to have more foodstuffs in South Africa, or are we going to just struggle to export at these higher maybe tariffs?
Bryan, I think we would probably continue. My understanding is that citrus and some other fruit commodities are some agricultural products that finds its way into an US market. But there remains many other markets where we export some of our fresh fruit to. But I think in essence, what is more important, South Africa remains a net importer of food-related products. If we talk wheat, for example, which I mentioned as an example, rice, for example, is a commodity product in South Africa as well. So we are probably far more economically exposed as consumers to the import element and the cost that it brings to our food basket.
Okay, well, those three areas, and I could have brought so many other people on to talk about price increases, but I thought that electricity, healthcare and food. But we're going to take a short break. When we return, I've got questions for our participants this evening about energy, about healthcare and about food. Stay tuned, we'll be back shortly.